Just making sure. This is, like I said, I haven't done this for a while. So, so anyway, as Julie said, and as you all know, looking at the schedule, this is the photographic journey through the land of the Golden Fleece. The word is Sakartvelo. That's actually what Georgians call their country. And if you've never heard of Georgia, you'd actually be surprised because you probably have. This is where Jason, the Greek Jason, went on a search for the Golden Fleece, and the statue of Medea is in Batumi, and that's where it is believed that the Golden Fleece was when Jason was out sailing looking for it. So anyway, just a quick overview. I imagine probably those of you who know me and are on my newsletter kind of have a sense of where Georgia is, but just to give you a quick place of it, it's in the Iberian Peninsula. To the west of us is the Black Sea. To the north of us is Russia. And then to the south of us is Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. We were actually just talking before a lot of you came on, and there's archaeological evidence showing that Georgia is the oldest wine producing country in the world. And the wines here, people are very, very proud of their wines, and it's been pretty amazing going throughout the different regions and trying the wines. Today, and I should also that this isn't a formal presentation. If anybody has a question, unmute yourself and fire away. Try to leave some room at the end for questions too. But we're going to start off in Batumi, and then we're going to journey up north. You can't really see it, but that's Mount Kazbegi and the little town of Kazbegi. And then we're going to end up where Corey and I have been living for 6 months, and that's Tbilisi, the largest city here in Georgia. So starting in Batumi, there's an Australian blogger that Corey and I follow her work quite a bit. She's traveled extensively through Georgia and Turkey, and every time we go somewhere, she's always the first blog that we consult. But she really nailed Batumi just perfectly, that it's several cities rolled into one. And from out of the country, people will kind of say that Batumi is like like Las Vegas, like the Georgian Las Vegas, but not the Las Vegas that has Charlie's tortillas and good green chili. That it's that other Las Vegas with the bright lights and everything. But then it's also an old seaport. During the Soviet years, it was a resort town. And now people say it's almost like a little Dubai. There's a lot of major construction going on, new hotels. And the first image I have, we were walking around one night during our last stay there, and I thought this just summed up Batumi really well, the old and the new. And wherever you walk through the city, you see these contrasts between the two that I think is really fascinating. And like it showed on the map, Batumi is on the Black Sea coast. We're walking around almost every evening, and just, I guess me being from New Mexico and the other New Mexicans on this call will appreciate, when you're around this much water, you just kind of are taken back by it. And the evenings here were just absolutely beautiful. And the mountain range that you see in the back are the end of the Caucasus Range. And there's the train that we took from Tbilisi to Batumi. I didn't sleep well the night before we left. I was so tired, but I didn't want to fall asleep on the train because the view from Tbilisi all the way to Batumi through the Caucasus, it was stunning. And then when you leave, I mean, when we left a few days later, the mountains were still misty, and just it's probably some of the most amazing scenery that I've seen in my life. This is actually right outside of Batumi, and it's in the Batumi Botanic Gardens. And during the Soviet rule, this was actually the second largest botanic gardens in the Soviet Union. It was designed by, and I'm sorry, I have to apologize to the translator because these names are going to get weird, but a man named Ihsan Gordezian, who brought plants in from all over the world. There's even plants from, I think, the Pacific Northwest and the Americas, from Asia. And didn't see, I didn't make a note on how many acres the garden is, but everybody who says, kind of talks about the garden says you should spend a full day in the gardens. It is that big, but as you can see here, parts of the garden just have just absolutely amazing views of the Black Sea. And I think part of the reason it takes so long is it's a large space, but you have to stop and just take in the scenery like every 10, 20 feet, it feels like. But the person who designed this garden, when you walk around in Batumi, there's a boardwalk that is just teeming with different plants and sculpture that Yasan was actually in charge of designing that too. And it's a really nice tie-in between the gardens and Batumi, the city. Some of these, like I said, I'm a desert guy, so when you put me by an ocean with the camera, you're probably going to get overwhelmed with pictures by the ocean because I just kind of completely, my brain went into overdrive seeing that much water, and never being able to photograph water before was kind of neat. But this one I just stopped. It's simply just a beach shower, but I loved how abstract it was against the sky, and the orange of the shower just kind of, it looked like a modern art sculpture and not a shower, so I had to take that photo. And this was taken one night. We had, on I think the third day we were there was just this torrential rainstorm that everything just turned gray. It was quiet, there was no wind. You could see the clouds moving in from over the sea, and we knew we were going to get a downpour. And it just rained like crazy for about an hour, 2 hours. It was like a New Mexico monsoon. But then in the evening, it just cleared up, and we had these gorgeous clouds. This was a few minutes before the sun went down on the horizon. The bad thing about the beach is it's a very rocky beach. It's not like California beaches with sand where you can just throw a beach blanket out. This is pretty much what the beach looks like up and down the coast in Batumi. It's kind of hard to walk on barefoot. When I was talking about the contrast, this is the Armenian Apostolic Church. And Corey and I were walking through some of the older parts of Batumi one night. And I had a camera with me, but I didn't bring a tripod because I thought we'd be back at our room a lot earlier. And this is what photographers call the Hail Mary shot, because it was dark and I had to find something to balance the camera on to act as a tripod. But this church was really interesting. You'll see I've got a section coming of churches in Fleece, or it looks like I might have frozen, so I'm sorry if I did. Churches were either destroyed or they were repurposed into something else. And this church was repurposed into a planetarium during the Soviet rule. Some churches were converted into prisons, others into museums. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the churches very quickly, all the denominations reestablished themselves. As I said, Batumi is kind of like people say it's like a Las Vegas, like Georgian's Las Vegas. And when you walk down the boardwalk, you can see why. It's not quite as crazy as walking down the strip at night, but with all the new buildings and the carnival on the boardwalk, it almost has a kind of a circus-like atmosphere to it, which is fun. We actually really enjoyed it. It wasn't quite as, Corey and I aren't fans of the strip in Las Vegas, but we actually really enjoyed every night walking up and down the boardwalk in Batumi. And this is another one after that storm. We were there probably several weeks before the tourist season really took off. So we got to enjoy uncrowded beaches and fairly quiet nights along the boardwalk. This was kind of funny. It was a small children's roller coaster along the boardwalk, and we never actually saw anybody ride it. And every night that we walked by it, it had moved like 10 feet. So we didn't know exactly what they were doing, but they were obviously doing something. When I saw it, I had to take a photo of it because, again, it was a great sky. This was actually taken a little bit before that storm. It was started off, the sky was just blue, and then some of the clouds started rolling in. You can kind of see in the distance over the Black Sea that the rain is starting to move in. To the left side of this photo, the storm moved in from that side. It was almost black on that side. Our next stop is Kazbegi, and I actually had an experience with Georgians in the early 90s. When I graduated from art school, one of my first assignments was, or freelance gigs, was I was asked to photograph a meeting between Georgian government officials and American businessmen that took place in Denver. And the Georgian, it was obviously free of the Soviet Union. It was an independent republic at that time. So the government was trying to secure investment into the country. And we went out to a brew pub every night, and the Georgian ministers were just really a neat group of people, but they absolutely loved bragging about their homeland. And this quote just stuck with me because one of the ministers told me that, when God created the earth, he had a basket that held the world's beauty. And in Georgia, he tripped and fell and spilled the basket over the country. And they said that with so much passion. I thought, wow, I've really got to go see that sometime. And it took me 20 years. But when I got to Kazbegi, I realized what they were talking about. That the Kazbegi region is probably the most beautiful spot on earth that I've ever seen. And the closer you get to it, the more breathtaking it gets. And on the way back, we had shared a ride with a younger Italian man who had worked several years in Switzerland. And I asked him, how does Kazbegi compare to Switzerland? And he was saying that there's a lot more services in Switzerland. It's a lot more built up. But in terms of the scenery, he said there's no comparison. That Kazbegi kind of makes Switzerland seem a little dull. But on the car ride out, you feel like you're going through some of the sets of Sound of Music, and then you get into these really steep, rugged mountains through the Daryali Gorge. The gorge starts outside of Kazbegi, the town, and goes up. It's about 7 miles from the Russian border, and the up into Russia itself was kind of a major trading route from the first century. So it's not uncommon when you're out hiking around the Kazbegi area to see these old medieval watchtowers. They're scattered throughout. The mountain behind is Mount Kazbek, and the locals refer to it as the Bride because, like in this photo, it's almost always veiled with clouds. And this was one of those times where we were hiking back on this trail, Corey and I, and we just had to stop and take it in. We just stood there for probably 10 minutes because the view was just absolutely stunning. And we were dead tired, but the view was good. This is on the other side. There's a trail that goes up to the Trinity Church, which is a complex that was built in, I want to say, the 14th through the 16th century. And Corey and I actually didn't make it to the steep hike up to the monastery. And it was our third hike of the day. And we were if we didn't get back into town, we would have missed our shuttle back to Tbilisi, so we actually didn't make it. But the hike up, it started drizzling a little bit, and the clouds were moving in, and just the way the sun kept breaking through the clouds and landing on the landscape below. That's just something that I'm going to carry with me the rest of my life. Seeing that, like I said, it is a beautiful part of Georgia. This is the Gavleti waterfall. And again, Carol, I apologize for throwing these into. Carol is doing sign language interpretation, so to interpret Gavleti, McVary, and other Georgian names might be she's getting her workout today. So anyway, there's two waterfalls just outside of Kazbegi, and one is a longer hike than the other, but they're both very steep, rocky hikes to get to the waterfall. And we were with a couple friends and a Georgian guide. And the Georgian guide, I don't know how many times she's been up and down this hill. She was a woman that you could tell just spent her days hiking. And it was just really fun watching her, because even though she's seen these waterfalls so many times, to see her just kind of look at them in awe is, I didn't feel so bad, with my mouth gaping when she was doing the same. And this is going up to the larger waterfall, just a little, I guess in New Mexico we'd call it a river, but everybody else in the world calls it a creek. There's a monastery just outside of Kazbegi called the Darieli Monastery Complex. And most of the Orthodox churches, you cannot take photos inside the church. And it's a shame, because you walk in and they're just, when you see the icons, the paintings on the wall, the artwork painted on the walls, and I have a camera hanging down on my side and the lens cap has to stay on. It kind of drives me crazy, because they're just beautiful structures inside. So when we were in the Darieli complex, there was a monk who was probably in his early 30s and was kind of following me along. And I asked him, Shades Leba, and pointed to my camera, Shades Leba Potoebi, are photos permitted? And he looked at me and he had a very stern face. If you think about all the Russian Orthodox paintings with the long beard and stern face, subtract about 20, 30 years, and that's what this man looked like, a very young Orthodox icon. And he looked at me and nodded, asked me where I was from, and told him New Mexico, and he nodded. And I thought he didn't understand it at first, so I repeated, Shades Leba Potoebi? And he nodded again, and in English answered me, please do. And I thought, I can take photos inside this church. And this dome was really, when I saw the dome, I was really hoping he would say yes. It's a new monastery. I think it was completed in 2011, but it still had this very old, established feel to it. So I was actually pretty happy, and I guess other tourists were in there just snapping photos, and he must have been pleased that I'd asked him for permission, because later he invited me and the group we were with to taste wine that the monastery makes. And so we had a little bit of wine before we attempted our 3 hikes too, which made the day even more fun. And now we're moving into Tbilisi. And those of you who follow my newsletter know that I keep calling Tbilisi a city of contrast. And it just is an amazing city. We've been here for 6 months, and I still absolutely love going out and exploring. There's very modern architecture. There's architecture there's a church that we'll see coming up that was built in the 500s. There's 1800s kind of Art Deco, Art Nouveau architecture. And sometimes it's just turn the corner and you go from kind of an old rundown looking building from way back when to an Art Nouveau, and then you see something new built. And I tell people, if you're a fan of strict zoning codes, Tbilisi probably isn't for you because it's just jumbled all together. But this is taken from the Bridge of Peace along the Macvarty River. And kind of scanning through, you can really see there's some very new architecture in the photo. And Darlene, you probably remember this because this is about 2 seconds for that visual tour. This was actually taken right after right after the tour that I gave. But as you walk around this area, you immediately get into these like the 1800s buildings, and right across these buildings is one of Tbilisi's oldest churches, and just across the river is Tbilisi's old town with it goes up to the hill to the, I want to say, the Nakari fortress. But you just walk through these little narrow streets and see the little balconies, the wood balconies that Tbilisi is known for. And it feels like you've stepped back in time. And in the evening, Corey always laughs because I come home from taking photos and I'm always hungry for something ethnic. Because in the evenings, when you walk through, everybody's cooking with spices. So the air is just laden with paprika and garlic and onions and ajika. It's like a pepper that's used here. And it's just every turn you make, somebody's cooking something. And after a few hours of wandering around in Old Town, I always feel like I have to come home and we can't just have pasta and chicken. We have to have something unusual with a lot of garlic. But and this is actually, I'm going to go back, kind of as you cross the bridge, and in the photo, if you go left around that church, there's a little pathway that leads to this waterfall that's just right in the middle of the city. And it's kind of, when you're there by yourself, it's very relaxing. It's a little path that ends up, and there's a little viewing area where you can just sit and enjoy the waterfall. But walking up to it, almost every night that I've gone to it, there's been Georgian musicians playing music, and it's just this hubbub of activity. And then you walk about 20, 30 meters and you feel like you're out in the middle of a forest somewhere. It's really amazing. This is still in that same area. This is the Queen Darjan Palace that was built in 1776. And Corey and I are kicking ourselves because that blue balcony that you see on the side of the image apparently has some really good views of the old town in Tbilisi, but we have yet to actually go inside the palace. And one of the things when you walk around the old town district, and actually even through Tbilisi, is you kind of feel like you're walking into somebody's yard or alley. And on Google Maps, they'll give you directions and it feels like you're cutting through. It's like, is this really the way? And it's confusing. But as old as the city is, you just have these narrow little passageways, and that is how you get from point A to point B. The streets aren't really a whole lot larger. When I do video tours with people in the States, they always ask me, is that a one-way street or a two-way street? And this is not a street, but the real streets are about wide enough for two cars to barely get by if the drivers are nice. But it's this is one of my favorite parts of exploring the city, because it seems like every time I go out, I just pick an alley and start walking down. Always and happy with what I find. The first photo of Tbilisi I had, that I said was taken from the Bridge of Peace, and it kind of looks like a large glass caterpillar that spans the river. And at night, it's very noticeable because there's a lighting display that starts a half hour after dusk and then goes all through the night until sunrise. And it has different lighting patterns. It's fun just to watch. But when they built this, and even now you see people who are really upset that this bridge was put in, because it is in a historic part of the city, and it really stands out as very, very modern architecture. I think it's kind of a neat contrast, but you still have people who are very angry that this modern bridge was built in the middle of the old part of the city. I was going to say the Bridge of Peace was built in 2010, and this puppet theater was actually built in 2010 as well. It's in the This is right next door to the oldest surviving church in Tbilisi. And it was built, I'm going to butcher the guy's name, Rezo Gabriadze. If you look up Georgian puppet theater, he's actually a very interesting character. He's known around the world as a screenwriter, artist, puppeteer. And this is the puppet theater that his troupe has here in Georgia. And they say it's adult puppets, but it's not X-rated puppets. They're just more sophisticated themes than Sesame Street. But this building is really fun because you walk up to it and you think that you're seeing something very old, and then you realize that it's just built very whimsically to match the surrounding area, but it's actually a very new building. And then this is a little bit further into town from the old town, the Orbliani district. And it's actually one of my, Corey and I, our favorite parts to Tbilisi to walk through. You see a lot of the restored buildings from the 1800s. They're just very stately. Right next to this building is actually the presidential palace. So the Georgian president, the Georgian White House, is smack dab in the middle of all these apartments. The only way you could really tell it's a government building is at any given time there's 3 or 4 very serious guards standing out front who give photographers dirty looks when they get too close. But this whole district has gone under some renovation, and it's just, especially at night, it's a really amazing district to walk through. And Linda, this is your photo. This is Orbliani Square. Linda arranges flowers, so every time I see this photo, I always think of her. This is taken later in the year. It was actually just taken about 3 weeks ago, but in the early spring, that this whole area is just coated with color. You've never seen so many flowers in one area. It's just these little stalls of floral stalls, and you always know when you're getting close because the air just is so perfumed with all the flowers. There's bees everywhere. You watch the people look like bees. They're kind of darting in and out of the flower stalls, and people inside are clipping flowers and arranging them, and it's just this hub of activity. And unfortunately, by the time I got my act together and took a photo of it, it was a little later in the fall, so the color isn't quite as astounding as what it is normally. Earlier I mentioned the Narikala Fortress on top of the hill. This is the oldest structure in Tbilisi, and there's archaeological evidence that puts the original buildings around the 4th century, but most of the surviving buildings that are surviving structures that you see now were built in the 16th and 17th century. But you can take a cable car to the top of it or hike up a very steep street, and the views of Tbilisi are just incredible from the fortress. But on the other side of the fortress from Tbilisi is the Tbilisi Botanic Gardens. And it's not, I don't think it's as big as Batami's garden, but it's still, Corey and I have been there 3 times and we still have not seen all the gardens. It's so expansive. But this is the little Japanese garden that it's probably about the size of like a large yard in the States. It wasn't really a big Japanese garden, but just the rest of the grounds are really expansive. It's a beautiful place. And now we move along to, this is Rustaveli Avenue. Rustaveli is actually, it was named after the kind of revered Georgian writer Rustaveli, who wrote a book. His major work is called The Knight in the Panther Skin, and every Georgian has read it. They can quote it. I've been trying to read it. It's like reading Chaucer. I'm obviously reading it in English, so I don't know what the translation's like, but it's a good story, but it's a very epic poem. I'll just put it that way. I'm still not finished with it. But this avenue was in the late 1800s. This is one of the areas where the money was. And then when Russia annexed Georgia, the Russians built a lot of the buildings. Before then, I was reading that the only thing really on this street was a single church, that it was all the old town. And it really just kind of grew up overnight. But in the evenings, it doesn't matter if it's a Monday night, Friday, Saturday. These sidewalks are just full of people. This is a very long exposure, so the people are all blurred out. But it's just this constant ebb and flow of people that just, it's an exciting place to be. It feels like you're in the middle of a city, and when you're surrounded by these just amazing 1800s buildings, a lot of times Corey and I walk down the street and we still can't believe that we live here. And this is from a fountain in Rustaveli Square. And I just like this photo. This is why I threw it in. I was so tired one night after walking up and down, and there's a metro stop just around the corner from here. And I walked by and saw the light reflecting in the waterfall and thought, oh, that's really pretty, and kept walking. Almost got on the subway, and I thought, if I thought it was really pretty, why didn't I take a photo of it? So I went back, set up my tripod, and then got home. And I know it's hard to see in this photo, but uh, if you know what the buildings look like behind it, you can actually see the buildings reflected in the waterfall. So I was giggling, kind of happy when I saw those buildings reflected. And what I was saying about just kind of venturing down these alleyways, that's been one of my favorite hobbies since I've been here, is picking an alley and seeing what you can see. The building with the spire behind this is a theater. It was home to the Russian Cinematic Society. I forgot the exact name of it. Now, when you go through along the front of it, there's artisans that sell paintings and jewelry, and kind of like the Governor's Palace in Santa Fe. And this is another square with just this amazingly gorgeous architecture. This is it's on the tip, but Majarnishvili Square. There's a large theater just down the way, but when you walk down, you see how much money just must have been poured into these buildings in the 1800s. And when you follow this street down, it's it's probably about a mile and a half of just these stately restored buildings on this broad avenue. There's this beautiful movie theater that was built. I'm not sure when it was built, but the outside has all this like Art Nouveau, Art Deco scroll work to it. Corey wants to buy it desperately. As soon as we have several $1 million, we will buy it. But it's, this street is always been one of my favorite streets, because it takes you back in time. And even though there's cars whizzing down the street, it's a large one-way avenue. You can easily just, if you tuned all that out, you can easily just picture horse-drawn carriages and women in dresses, men in top hats. And this was actually taken in that same area. I love looking at the details of these buildings, because I thought, I guess there are modern buildings where there's a lot of attention paid to detail, but I always think about the people who did the iron work, did the plaster work, carved the stone, And then you just look at building after building after building that has all this ornamentation on it. It's just beautiful. And this is one of the sad things. I think photographically, I really love it because it has texture, it has personality. But a lot of times when you walk by apartments, really anywhere in the city, you can see some of the apartments are former mansions that during the Soviet times were just carved up into apartments. And no attention was really paid to preserving any of the details, any of the bourgeoisie nature of the mansions. And you look into some of these entryways and you think how beautiful this building must have been when it was first built. And again, all the plaster work and then it's just kind of carved up into apartments. The first Airbnb that we had here in Tbilisi, when you stepped outside and looked at it, it was in this row of mansions and the facade was just amazingly beautiful. And you go in through a back door and it felt like you were going up a prison staircase. It's just cement. Everything was painted gray, just completely dismal. And then you get into the apartment. It's this beautiful woodwork, hardwood floors, carved wood on the windows and doors. But I thought it really is a shame. I said visually, I think it's fun to take photos of, but it's always a shame thinking about how these buildings were just kind of mowed through without any thought. There's another one. Corey, actually, we were walking down the street and Corey grabbed me and she happened to notice the stairway and pulled me back and insisted I take a photo. And I'm glad that I did. This is the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Tbilisi, taken from the Macquarie River along one of the major avenues through towns. And almost any place in the city, you can see this cathedral. And at night, it's really stunning and impressive. A lot of people think it's an old cathedral. It was actually, I think, completed in, I want to say 2011. But when you walk by it, on the left is some of the stonework and you can see the carvings in the windows. It just feels timeless. And then the photo on the right is the entryways through the bell towers. You kind of feel like you're going into a castle when you walk into the grounds, and the grounds are just planted with gardens. It's right on the edge of the city and you just feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere. It's just these beautiful, peaceful, thoughtful, relaxing gardens that you just sit and listen to birds and stare at flowers all day. It's a really well thought out area. But the Holy Trinity is where a lot of government functions, kind of like the Buckingham Palace, a lot of the Georgian government functions take place at the Holy Trinity. We have to look at my notes because I always mispronounce this. This is the Anchiskadi Basilica. This is actually the oldest surviving basilica in Tbilisi. It was originally built in the 500s, and most of what you see today is built in the 15th or 17th centuries. And this is one of the places where, if I could take a photo in a church, I walked in, and while your eyes are adjusting to the dark, because it's black when you walk into the church, and all you hear is Georgian chant, and it just immediately takes you to a different place, if you're religious or not. It really just kind of moves your soul. And then as your eyes start adjusting, you start seeing the gold icons around the room, and the incense was drifting up into the dome windows and creating these streaks of light. And I thought, oh, I really, really want to get a picture of this. But there was a woman who was overseeing everything. So she kind of had a look that if I even thought about taking my camera out, I would have felt the wrath of the church come down on me through this moment. She didn't look like she was willing to play games. But plus, I respect the fact that they don't want photos taken. And but if you're ever in an area like this, really going into these churches and experiencing it um, is just really breathtaking. This is a newer church. It's the cathedral at the Chronicle of Georgia. And the Chronicle of Georgia started in the during the Soviet rule, and they call it the Georgian Stonehenge. And I didn't think about putting that actual photo, but if you Google Chronicle of Georgia, you'll see what a kind of a neat building this is. But we went there the first time Corey and I went. There was this beautiful blue sky, and thought, oh, I want to get a picture of this church, but the beautiful blue sky wasn't doing anything. I want something moody. So the next week we started having, they weren't really monsoons, but it just rained every day nonstop. So I was a drenched little photographer running around. There's really no cover around there. I came back just soaking wet, had to ride the bus and the metro back to the apartment soaking wet, but I was really happy I did, because this is my favorite photo from here. And then this is the Cochetti St. George Church. Corey and I passed this church quite a bit. And you kind of notice as we're going through that Eastern Orthodox churches look very similar. And they're all designed to look like an old sailing ship. The idea is that the church is sailing towards heaven. And after a while, I kind of feel like, well, I'm taking one photo of the church. It looks the same. It looks the same. It looks the same. And this church really intrigues me because I probably have about 10 photos of this church, and they're all very different. And every time I walk by, I just notice something, a different angle of the church, something different. So it's really, even though it looks like every other church, it's become one of my favorite churches. And you'll see in the end slide that I had a really fun time doing something with one of the priests from the church. This is the St. Nicholas Orthodox Church. It's you can see in the lower right part of the photo, the fortress wall. It's part of the fortress. The church itself is a modern addition to the fortress. This is a Russian Orthodox church, and I don't believe it's being used anymore. It's fenced off. But to get here, Tbilisi's in a valley. And most of the time when you walk around the city, it's very flat, but there are some places that I can't even imagine going up to this in the winter time, because my feet were slipping on the cobblestone streets in the summer when it was just completely dry. And I burned about 500 calories just walking up the street to get to this church. But it's really so pretty. It was built in 1913, and was consecrated as the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. And this is another Russian Orthodox church here, kind of more in a central area of town. The photo on the left, I kept walking by. I took the photo on the right, one of the first times that I saw it, and never actually went into the grounds. And one evening, I was walking around and walked by the front of it, and I thought, that's really pretty. So I walked in, and there was this older woman that I couldn't tell if she was a beggar or what, but she was sitting by the front gate, and she kept telling me, Aditya, go, go. And she was motioning me to go into the church. And she kept like she was holding a camera up and taking pictures, and she wanted me to go take pictures in the church. And there's a very large sign at the entry of most Orthodox churches, as there is here, they're saying no camera. And I thought, I'm not going to go in and take a photo inside the church, but she kept standing there behind me, which is Russian for go, go, go. And but just even taking a photo of the outside, again, it's this little plot of land, but around a lot of these churches, there's these little gardens that just serve as a escape from the city. And this is the Juma Mosque, and this is one of the rare mosques in the world, because it is one of the few mosques that both Sunni and Shia pray together, worship together. In the late 50s, the Shia mosque was destroyed to make room for a bridge, and the Sunnis allowed them to pray, to worship in the church. And originally it had a curtain that separated the two sects, and today everybody just prays together. It's the curtain's removed. But apparently the Russian authorities really tried to crack down on the Orthodox Church, but like the synagogue and the Muslim communities were less impacted by the anti-religious nature of the Soviets, so that they were able to continue worshiping through the Soviet rule. And this is a church. When I showed the first slide in Tbilisi, where I said right across the way is a medieval church, this is that medieval church. It was built in the 6th century. And during the Soviet rule, it was used as a youth drama theater and a workshop. And now it's back to an Orthodox church. And they had to repaint the inside. And it's really amazing. They did an amazing job. Corey studied medieval history, and it took her a while to realize that it was a modern painting. It's done to really look like, to mimic what it would have looked like when it was built. And now, real quick, I'm going to give you a sneak peek. If you subscribe to my newsletter, you know that I'm working on a project called 100 Doors of Tbilisi. Started wandering around and just kind of fell in love with all the different styles of doors. So it's been a project that I've been working on for probably about 3 or 4 months now. I'll probably continue through the winter and the spring. And I'm looking at trying to get a book published next month, but I'm not going to show you all 100 doors because we only have 10 minutes. But I just kind of have a selection of some of the doors around that'll be included. This is going to be on the cover. And when I talk about these beautiful stone plaster works, it's fun just going through, exploring the city and turning a corner and seeing something like this. And with that, I would say you can go onto my website, seanweaverphotography.com, and see other pictures of Georgia, New Mexico, other places, and sign up for my newsletter if you haven't. I ramble less in my newsletter than I do in person, I hope. And you could also hear stories. I told you the kind of funny adventure that I had in front of the Cushetti Church. He couldn't speak any English, I couldn't speak any Georgian, and yet somehow the two of us managed to feed pigeons together. The priest in this church walked out and he was feeding pigeons and walked up to me and handed me a handful of seeds, and the two of us spent a few minutes feeding pigeons together. It was pretty fun. So with that, as they say in Georgian, Didi Medlova, thank you very much. And we have 9 minutes. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
You grow the mustache to fit in over there, Sean?
No, I realized, all right, how do I stop sharing my screen? Sorry, bear with me. That sounds like a Brandon question.
It does.
You have stopped sharing your screen. I don't see it anymore.
Okay, good. No, I shaved everything off during the pandemic and realized that I hate that kind of baby-faced look. So I had to at least try something. Thank you, Alexis.